to another Through the Bible. It's been a long time, but we are going to attempt to do the whole scroll of Chronicles because it's split up into two, like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is divided into two, but it is one continuous book. So let's try to do it right and do the whole thing today. Some people think we can't do it, but this is why I exist, to prove you all wrong.
For such a time as this.
For such a time as this. All right, the book of Chronicles. So actually, guys, there's no new history we're covering in this book. So that's why I think we can do it. Chronicles is a bit of a review book. It does have unique material, so it's not just complete copycat. Think of it like we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? All four of those books basically cover the same period of history, right? More or less. They cover the life of Jesus in different pieces, but some of them, the stories are the same. Some of them, the stories are different. Chronicles is kind of like that. It's another perspective. It's another writing on this period of history for a purpose. So let's start with our author. We didn't really know very clearly who wrote 1st and 2nd Kings, and we know Samuel was probably involved in the writing for Samuel, but definitely didn't finish it. So, but we do have a little bit more information. Chronicles doesn't say who wrote it, but most Jewish tradition says that Ezra wrote it. Ezra is a guy whose book we're going to cover. He is a priest who was involved heavily in the return of Israel to the land, the rebuilding of the temple, and then Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries, right? So, where did we leave off in history with the end of Kings, 2nd Kings? Where is God's people at this point in history?
Judah was exiled to Babylon.
So, we have the northern kingdoms. They've been carried off by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom now too. Even though there's been some good kings in the southern kingdom, they still worship God. They had set up idols in the temple. Like, come on, guys. Like, how bad do you have to get? And if we learned about Josiah. Josh talked about King Josiah at the retreat,
was
right?
So epic, guys.
And King Josiah was a boy king. He became king at 8 years old, right? And then this shows how bad it was. They had lost the Bible.
The priests
because
who were in the temple.
They found this book, they found this scroll, and oh, what's this? And it's the Torah. And they're like, oh. And then Josiah reads it, and he's just tears his clothes, is distraught, right? So Josiah had already been doing good and cleaning up and getting rid of the idols, but it was 10 years later that he actually found the Bible when he was 26 years old and was like, oh, we're doing this wrong. So even though Josiah makes a good turn, God promises, I will not carry off the people to destruction in your lifetime, but it's still going to happen. So they are carried off to Babylon, and we're going to talk about that more when we get into Daniel, the book of Daniel, because that all happens in Babylon. But it's interesting, the order of things. Now we have this book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and I think it's placed here because, again, it covers the events that we've just covered with basically 2nd Samuel, so the life of David, and then the Judah kings. It doesn't really talk about the northern kingdoms. It just kind of focuses on the southern kingdoms. So it is a book genre of history and genealogies. Tons of genealogies in this book. And you may say, oh, genealogies are boring. And I kind of agree with you. It can be if you just read the sons of Shem, Eliam, Asur, Axapad. It can be fun if you read these names. Lud and Aram. Anyway, lots of lists of names. And this guy starts, what's the first word in this book? Adam. So we're starting all the way back at the beginning. This is a major review book.
I feel like I do this 3 times. I'd be like, guys, remember
the story. So really, the purpose of these genealogies are to help the people remember. Because when I just say the word Adam, what comes to your mind?
The garden.
The garden, right? So saying Adam, Seth, Enosh, boom, we go back to the garden and we remember, oh, God created, this is the start of humanity, this is the process. When you mention the sons of Noah, what do you think of?
The flood.
The flood, right? So without retelling the story, he's just doing this genealogy to remind you of the key characters, the key people in the biblical story. So without retelling the story, this is like a mini summary of the Bible, but you kind of have to know the Bible. It doesn't have all the details in there, but it's meant to make you remember these stories. Yes.
So did Ezra remember all of these, or did God tell him?
So at this time,
I feel he would forget.
So at this time, they would have regathered the scriptures to them. The coolest thing is Daniel was able to preserve the scriptures even in captivity. So thanks to Josiah and them finding it, the scriptures didn't get burned. The Torah, the scriptures remained, the important books remained. And the Bible was obviously still being written at this time. But we know that he had access to the Torah. He had access, because he quotes directly from 2 Samuel and 1st and 2 Kings. He had those in front of him as he wrote this. So it wasn't like, oh, we lost them, I have to rewrite them. He was writing them with a different purpose to a new audience. So who is our audience? It is Israel, the Israelites who are returning from exile. So we've got these people who have been carried off as slaves. They've been forced to, actually they didn't get just assimilated into the Babylonian culture. As when we look at Daniel, we're going to see how God retained this people, and stories like Queen Esther, all that happens then. And even fast forward, we know, they had scriptures, and then they leave scriptures behind, because the wise men that show up to Jesus' door, we think they're from this area and from Babylon. And why do they have scriptures? They know the prophecy, and they saw the star, and they came to Israel to see it, probably because of people like Daniel who kept the study of the scriptures going. And Daniel was a wise man. He was part of that community. Anyway, super cool. So this is to the Israelites returning from exile. They're coming back to the land after 70 years in captivity. They need to know how to be a people. They need to know how to worship God. They're rebuilding the temple. There's tons of details in here on the original building of the temple. They're trying to restore things to where they were. So this is a book of talking about the way things were and really highlighting the best of it. What you're going to find as you read this, think of the First Chronicles is basically all about David. It doesn't put in any of David's shortcomings. It doesn't put in the Bathsheba story. And I really don't think, and read from other people too, the author was not trying to make us think that Daniel was perfect. He knew that, because the book of Samuel was readily available, other people would have known it, he had it. He wasn't trying to cover anything up. He was trying to say, this is the best that we can be. Let's try to get back there. And let's look forward to a Messiah. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but it's pointing forward to the Messiah, the King Jesus, in the line of David. So it's interesting how it is written and the purpose it's written to, really to help the Israelites become a people of God once again and resume the worship of God. So when and where? It was written about 430 BC, but the events are from 1000 BC to 500 BC. So the First Chronicles covers just the life of David, really. So the kingly life of David, so a 40-year period. But it covers this time period, but it's written, closer to Jesus. So this is when they're returning. Now, did anybody find the book of Chronicles in this Jewish Bible? No. Where is it, Andrew?
Near the end.
Yes. It's actually, the Jewish Bible places Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, at the very end of the New Testament. So why do you think they do that? Yes, Addie?
To remind everyone, but I actually have a question.
Well, answer this question. To remind them, it has to do with when it was written. So we put it right after 1st and 2nd Kings because it deals with that story again. But the original Jewish audience put it in this, there's nothing wrong with putting it there or putting it there. It's just an order thing. They put it at the end because this is the purpose of when it was written. It was written at near the end of Israel's history, near the timeline chronologically. When it was written, not when the events happened, it was written as kind of a bookend reflection on the key events of the time of David and the kings. So it's placed in the Bible when it was written. We've covered all the history when all the minor prophets happen. They are prophets during these kings. So even though we've made it through all this timeline of history, we're going to be back in it until we finish the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's
because because after I guess we still haven't talked about the Daniel times and Esther timeline, but and Nebuchadnezzar and the different kings there, and then them returning Nehemiah and Ezra. But so we still have some time to cover, but they put it at the end because that was written and that was like the purpose. So Jewish Bible, I thought it was interesting. I read that and I was like, wait, I have a Jewish Bible. Let's see if it is. And this, in the order, they put it at the very end of the Old Testament. You had a question, Maddie.
Where does it take place?
Where does it take place? So this takes place in Israel. So the events of this would take place in Judah. Okay, Judah. So the southern kingdom. That's important. This book does not really, you know how 2 Kings goes back and forth between the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, back and forth. If you watched that video last week, you know you've got the 20 bad kings in the north, and then you got 20 kings in the south. 12 were bad and 8 were good, I think. Was that the amount? Anyway, this is just focusing on Judah. So the where of the events is Judah. So main characters. We start with David. David is key. He's basically the whole First Chronicles. So there's definitely a purpose behind this in writing and focusing on David. We got, though, 8 chapters of genealogies. Like it goes into all the different families. So this is like chronicling. We didn't talk about the name of this book. Chronicles. What is a chronicle?
It's the Chronicles of Narnia.
You've heard the Chronicles of Narnia. What else have you heard that word? A
A
series.
timeline.
It's an accounting. It's like a retelling. And so literally, we don't know if it was Ezra. History tells us, Jewish history thinks it's Ezra, but he's known in the book as the chronicler. He's the person recording the events, writing down the facts. It's like a retelling, a telling of the events. So Chronicles, the Chronicles of Narnia. It's the telling of the events. But we start with David. David is a huge character, the main character of First Chronicles, the whole book. Again, retelling his life, kind of the highlights, the good parts. Not to try to hide the bad parts, but to try to actually tell a message about who we're looking for in a Messiah, a perfect Messiah. And then we go into Solomon, David's son, of course, who kind of hit the peak. There's actually some extra stories in here about Solomon. There's some extra stories about David, and even his involvement in preparing the temple to be built, and then Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And then we get this story of Queen of Sheba with more details, which is interesting. And then a bunch of kings. So Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Josiah, Uzziah, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. So then it kind of goes through the retelling of the kings. So those are our main characters. Okay, we move the purpose up. So I want to hit the purpose before we get to the main characters, or the main events. I think this will help us. So again, maybe I've said this already, but parallels 2 Samuel and Kings as a commentary on it. Kind of like we have the 4 Gospels. It is written from a priestly point of view, so really heavily focused on the temple and the worship of God, because if it's Ezra, we think it is Ezra. He was a priest, and it emphasizes their religious worship history, really to prepare them for going back to be God's people and to worship him. All right, so our main events. Now we've got 9 chapters of genealogies. Really fun. Now, if the better you know your Bible, the more interesting this is. A bunch of names, because then some of them would stand out. But it does. Here's some forward in history. It does, in chapter 9, account for the people who returned out of exile, which is interesting. So 70 years in exile, and then these are the people coming back. They've been released. They've been set free, which is a huge, big deal. But then we go back in history to the reign of David. And so we got the stories of David. We know these stories well. We've gone over them, so that's why I think we can cover more. We've gone into this already. David becomes king over Israel. So we don't have Saul's life recorded here. We just have David. So he's hitting like the ideals, the ideal kings, and then by focusing on David. Extra stories we have that not as in detail, which stories I love, David's mighty men. So go read chapter 11 sometime. David's mighty men are some of the most epic stories in the Bible. There's this author who's writing a book series called The Day of War, and hopefully it'll get turned into a movie someday on David's mighty men specifically. it's crazy gory, and because it is, but it's like super epic battle, tough warrior guy stories. It's super epic, awesome. I hope they make movies about these guys because they are epic. They're like doing things like, one of the hilarious stories. King, because the mighty man, when David was on the run from Saul, he gathers like 300 men who are on the run too with him, and they form this little crazy band of like mercenary fighters, like super epic battle guys from all over the place and different experiences. David one day just sitting there like, oh, I wish I could have a drink from the water from Bethlehem where I grew up in the well, but it's like totally occupied by Philistines. So I can't believe it. So there's 3 epic guys. They're known as the 3. David's longed for water and said, this is verse 17 of chapter 11. Someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem. So the 3 broke through the Philistines' lines, just like go fight to get a drink of water, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. But David refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it on the ground before the Lord. These guys just went and killed a bunch of guys to get a drink of water for David. And they just had this big battle and almost died. And he's just like, I can't drink this. People died to get this water. He's like, that's not what I meant. Anyway, really funny stories. That's just an example. Such were the exploits of the 3 mighty men. These are just awesome, epic, crazy guys. And I hope these guys get a movie someday because it would be awesome. And then it lists out the mighty men. So more details, this isn't, again, just a review of the other books. We have new details that weren't written down. So, where did he get these stories? What do you guys think? He is writing this, 500 years later from these events, 500 plus years. Where do you think he got these stories from? Because they're not in 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings. Any ideas?
He could have seen the people that carried them out, maybe.
Oh, well, he is Ezra or the chronicler lived 500 years after these guys. So he's not an eyewitness to these events.
Okay.
Where else ideas of where he could have got these from?
That's all I raised my hand for.
What?
That's all I raised my hand for.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the families of these people would have probably been pretty proud of what they'd accomplished.
Mhm.
So they, I know that my great whatever grandfather was a physician in George Washington during the French Indian War. Well, you're not going to read that in history book.
Right.
But
That's
I know
important
that
to you.
because it's a part of our family.
Yes. Yeah. There's tons of history. Like, any history book, it doesn't record everything. There's no way, right? There's no way you can record everything. And some things are going to be, when you sit down to write history or a story, you're going to choose to include some details and not others. And that's just how it's going to be. You can't include everything. So the writers of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings didn't include everything. So there's probably oral history, stories that they would tell. Maybe there's some written history. Maybe it's written down. Maybe some of these stories were written and then it wasn't written and then he chose to include it. And I think because God was involved in the writing of his Bible, inspiring it, directing it, he chose these stories to be in here. He verified them as true. Different. We don't know, but I just wanted you to think about that. Oral history, written history that was not part of the Bible, but then included in the purpose of Chronicles. Yes, Addie.
My Bible has this beautiful comparison of 1st, 2nd Chronicles to Kings and 2nd Samuel, and it says everything in there.
They say all the things that are the same and the things that are different. Cool. That's really awesome. That would be interesting to go through. Because, it's not just a copy. It's not just a duplicate. There are different details. Yeah, Luke?
I was just wondering how they could make a whole book about mighty men. There are only 2 stories in here.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, so that book, they definitely are adding in details, but they like in the book series where the guy is writing it, The Day of War, there's one line about Benaniah, and it says Benaniah, the guy who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day, right? It's just that one line, and this guy wrote 2 chapters about it. He's definitely embellishing the story, right? And talking about, the lion, he just guessed, why did he have to kill a lion in a pit on a snowy day? And so the author is writing all this into it as a cool novel, as a story. So yes, there isn't much details, but like that story I just read about them going to fight the Philistines to get a drink of water. You could write, create a whole epic about the battle and the fight and how it went down, and what they had to do, the fence they had to jump over, and all the things they had to do to get that water, right? So it's set in the timeline of the biblical storyline with the details we have, and then tons of extra ideas on what it would have looked like, right? That's how it's written. Good thought. It's kind of like, we watch The Chosen, like they have some details from the Bible, and then they're adding in a lot too. And so that's why it's really important to know your Bible and to read those stories and be like, and not just because it's in The Chosen or because it's in a Jesus storybook, think that that's in the Bible, because it isn't always there. And there's nothing wrong with adding or speculating or guessing on what could have happened, but it would be wrong to claim that did happen, because we don't know if it's not in the Bible, and that's the authority we trust. So, being clear with that. So there's more stories. David brings the ark back to Jerusalem. It does really focus on kind of the temple worship and the rebuilding of the building of the temple, because up until this time it was only a tabernacle. It's still the temporary tent tabernacle from when they were wandering in the desert. And then so David builds himself a great palace, and then he's like, man, I live in this cool house. Why doesn't God live in a permanent cool house? And so he sets out to build there's more military exploits. I'm getting ahead of myself. Now we're in chapter 22. This is where this is new details. That's not we don't really see this. We see that David wanted to build the temple, but we actually get to see how much work he did to prepare to build the temple, to really set Solomon up for success. It's pretty cool. So David wants to build this temple, like I was saying, for God. God says that's a good idea, but it's not you. You are a man of bloodshed, a violent man. David's history, I want a man of peace to build my temple. But so he says, I'm going to have your son build it. But David does do a lot of the preparations for assembling the temple. So we've got more. Look, the singers, the whole band is chapter 25. If you want to read about the band. Gatekeepers. All right, chapter 28, David's plans for the temple. Gifts for building the temple. And then we kind of end the first Chronicles with the death of David. So the first book of Chronicles really champions how great a king David was. Okay? And again, I don't think it's just trying to make us forget his downfalls, but it's really pointing ahead to the Messiah. Because who is the Messiah in the line of? David. So that's super important that it's in the line of David. And so they're championing David, looking back in history. Remember the good days of David. Remember how great David was. Guess who we're waiting for? The Messiah, who's going to be a king like David, who's going to have a heart like David. And so they highlight David's best, not to ignore his faults, but to point us to what we're waiting for, point us to what we're in expectation of. Okay, so we got the genealogies, the reign of David, and now we start 2 Chronicles with his son. What's his son's name? Solomon. What was Solomon all about? What's some cool things about Solomon? Wisdom. He asked God for wisdom. God blesses him. His house and reign. This is like, David was the best king, but Solomon brings in the best days for Israel. They're wealthy, they're prosperous, they build the temple, the worship of God is featured. He kind of brings in like the golden era of Israel, like the peak, the pinnacle, to the point where so we have him right away. He asks for wisdom and builds the army, finishes the peace, brings in the peaceful time for Israel. David has really conquered the enemies around that would be a threat to them, ushers in this season of peace for Solomon. Solomon builds the temple. He gets all these awesome trees from the north, all these supplies from all over the place. It describes in detail, we're chapter 4, the temple's furnishing. It's the size, very specific. The golden altar, take a look at all this. It's pretty cool, just the details. Everything's covered in gold, like super, super ornate and beautiful. And then chapter 5, he dedicates the temple. And 6. And 7, they're still dedicating the temple. And so it really ushers in this amazing time for Israel. Super epic, great times for Israel. And then we just Solomon's wealth continues to grow. This is also his downfall, if you remember. But he starts to get many, many, many wives, like 300 wives, 600 concubines, I think.
700 wives and 300 concubines.
So many
Total
wives.
1,000.
And then there's this story in here, the Queen of Sheba. And so this is a famous Ethiopian queen. She is written about in other historical books too. She was like an epic queen. She was super interested. She sent a guy to see, she'd heard stories about Solomon and his wisdom and wants to see it. So she goes and to see it. What?
Wasn't there like a thing where it's like in Ethiopia because of her?
So, and actually she brings back some Judaism with her. And then if you fast forward, I think these two stories are connected. The Ethiopian eunuch who sees Philip on the road, and he's reading an Isaiah scroll, and Philip's like, let me help you understand that, and introduces him to Jesus. Like there's Jewish people, Jewish worshipers in Ethiopia, 500 years later. So I did some research on this. I don't know if this is true or not. Some of the possible, and this is mainly from the Ethiopian perspective. It doesn't say it explicitly in the Bible, but supposedly, this is PG. King Solomon and Queen Sheba had a baby together. That's the rumor, because it says that he gave her everything she wanted. Verse 12, King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for. He gave her more than she had brought to him. She brought gifts. He sent her more with gifts. Then she left and returned to reunite to her own country. So I think he definitely introduced God to her, and I think she brought back the Jewish system of worship, possibly brought back a child. And then there was like this King Solomon line of David in Ethiopia. I think that's the way that this continues to play out in history. I think it's a possibility. But anyway, there is this, and then Ethiopia. After that Ethiopian eunuch goes back, he brings back the worship of Jesus to Ethiopia. And one of the earliest churches is actually in Ethiopia. So it's all connected to this, which is interesting. So after that, Solomon's splendor, he hits this great peak, but he also brings in with all the wives. What do the wives bring with them?
Other gods.
The worship of other gods. So once again, we have the downfall. Over and over, they turn away from just worshiping God to worshiping other things, which, idolatry looked different then, but we do the same thing. We go from trusting God alone to starting to trust the things of this world and want the things of this world. It's the same thing. It looks different than we experience because we don't have the same names for all these gods, Asherah, Baal, but we worship money, cars, fame, popularity, influence. All these things are the same for us. So they go through all the other kings of Judah. And so the downfall, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, is the first one to be like, I'm going to make things even harder on you guys. And then the kingdom splits. And then there's the different kings. So I'm not going to go through the kings again because we did that the last few weeks looking at all the kings. But Josiah and other kings are highlighted. Again, differently, that just kind of the kings of Judah are mentioned. But we have the good and the bad kings. Good and bad, back and forth. Josiah repairs the temple, stories in here in 2 Chronicles 24. If you remember at Snow Blast, Josh, the speaker, had us read from 2 Kings and Chronicles because there was different things in it. Wasn't that cool how we looked at both of those? Right, exactly what we're doing here. So Josiah, Uzziah, and then we end this book. Hezekiah purifies the temple. We have a good king, couple bad kings. Good king, couple bad kings. And then we end with Manasseh, Josiah, Judah, 36. Judah is exiled to Babylon. So we have the fall of Jerusalem. And that ends 2 Chronicles. And then we see the rebuilding. All right, let's pause here and watch. Yeah, they didn't give authorship to Ezra. I entertained that idea for a while and tried to do some research on it. There's not much evidence saying that he did. There's not much evidence saying that he didn't. So just going by the tradition of what the Jewish people give authorship to Ezra, there wasn't like too much out of his lifetime or anything, details that he wouldn't have been able to know. So I don't know. It doesn't say that he did. It doesn't say that he didn't. So I kind of went with, they went with he didn't. I went with maybe he did, according to tradition. Yeah, I love what they brought out. The two big ideas here. What are the two big themes that are championed in this book?
The coming Messiah.
Right, but the two big things they look at in history to point us to the coming of Messiah. Yes.
The kings and the
Temple. Yes. The kings in the temple. They say, look at King David. He is the type of king that God wants. Look at these other kings. A lot of them made a lot of mistakes. So we're looking for a perfect king and the temple. And so both of those point to Jesus. Both of those. The Messiah, because we are no longer, we're looking for a king. We're also looking for a priest. We're looking for a way to God. We're looking for a temple, like a way to worship God. And that is through Jesus. Both of those things are Jesus. Jesus fulfills the kings and the priests and the prophets. Like, he is all of those. He is everything we need. That's in the kings, the best of the best kings, David and Solomon, and the temple, the ideal time. So looking at these historical events really is pointing towards Jesus. So we see David highlighted as an ideal king to point to the type of Messiah we need. And do we want to look up that 14? 1 Chronicles 14:2. And the temple as being the system of worship that is being fulfilled. What was 14:2? And David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that his kingdom had been highly exalted for the sake of his people Israel. So in his king and family, God promised that he would be bringing in the Messiah. All right, what can we put down for a timeless truth? What do you guys think? What's an idea that we can pull out of this book? Ellie?
I look back in order to look forward.
Ooh, that's pretty cool.
A look back in order
A look back to look forward.
I
Luke.
like this, yeah.
This really isn't very good, but kind of the story of Chronicles, how a lot of people skip it. It could be like everything is important in many different ways.
Yeah. Even the details. Like, I love, you can do studies into the genealogies and why they include certain people.
But it says Chronicles 14. Is that first or second Chronicles?
First.
Oh, yeah.
First, that's what I just read. First Chronicles. Sorry. I have down from last time we went through this, First Chronicles, we must have done them separately, the importance of the worship of God. And Second Chronicles, be careful who you're friends with. I didn't go into that story, but Rehoboam, he counsels the older wise, his dad's advisors. And then he goes to decide what he should do, what kind of king he should be, to his friends. And they're like, and his older wise advisor is like, your dad Solomon, he was really hard on the people. You should make things easier, and then the people will like you.
Really,
and then his friends are like, no, you need to make things even harder. Show them how tough you are. And so he goes with his younger friend's advice and makes things harder on the people, and then half the kingdom leaves.
I remember what's in the Bible made that really funny, like
Yes.
video games with his friends.
Oh, another thing we learned today is that we can go through the whole book of Chronicles in one thing.
We did it, guys. The whole scroll of Chronicles. I'm so proud of us. So yeah, I think the big takeaway is how God used these people, like God's chosen people. Like, it's almost like you can look back at this and be like, why did God just choose this group of people? They're not even very good at it, like being God's people. They mess up all the time. But the whole big purpose was to produce a Messiah and to show us what type of Messiah and the reason we needed a Messiah. And this does a cool summary of it. We could put this at the end of the Old Testament. You see how that would even better point to its purpose? Well, why would that be interesting if we read it at the end of the Old Testament? What's next?
Jesus.
The Gospels, right? So you'd have this look back at the story of the people, and then next up would be Jesus, the Messiah. That would actually be a cool way to do it, and I see that as kind of a purpose. Maybe that's the best way to have it in the order of the Bible. The order of the Bible, the chapters, the verse numbers, that is not inspired part of the Bible. We don't claim that to be only one certain way. You can order the Bible in different ways for different purposes. That's not like God says it has to be this way. That's just, our English version.
I
right?
want to get a Chronicles Bible like each
Yeah.
all the minor prophets.
There's really cool,
dropped in.
there's different, there's nothing wrong with how this Bible's ordered. It has the words of God in it, right? All right, that's the book of Chronicles.